They were the Achilles heels of the Cold War. Runways. During the 1950s and 60s, tensions are high between the world's superpowers. Both sides, fearing the loss of their runways in the first few minutes of an attack, look in a new direction. If the runways are the problem, is the solution no runways? As the quest for vertical takeoff ensues, the aircraft left in its wake are some of the most wild and exotic ever seen. October 1956. The people of Hungary rise against their Soviet occupiers. Above the ancient rooftops of Budapest, Hungarian MiG-15 jets turn their city into a massive kill zone. Soviet tanks are pulverized and Soviet military helicopters shot down. For the first time since World War II, the Soviet Red Air Force goes down in open combat. But the tables are quickly turned. The Soviets pulverize the Hungarian airfields, squashing the uprising. This long-forgotten air war would have major repercussions for NATO's strategy.
One of the major challenges that NATO confronted in the 1950s was the notion of expanding Soviet military power. The fact that our air bases might not be available to us for use because they would be taken out very early in a conflict.
When the Soviet Union overran Hungary in 1956, Hungarian air bases were immediately put out of action. Vertical takeoff technology is a way to get around the destruction of air bases during the early days of a conflict.
What this drove for the Western Alliance was a tremendous amount of interest in vertical and short takeoff landing programs. We would fire F-100s or F-104s off stands using JATO boosters so that the aircraft would not need the requirements of a runway to take off from.
Vertical takeoff, or VTOL, had been pioneered by the Nazis in World War II.
At the end of World War II, Germany was being bombed day and night, and they were looking for something that could defend them that was more accurate than anti-aircraft guns, like some kind of guided missile, and didn't need a big airfield that could be bombed.
One Nazi VTOL design was the amazing Lerche, or Skylark, produced by the Heinkel Company. The Skylark employs ducted propellers for takeoff and forward flight. The pilot lies in a prone position in the extreme nose.
Another idea was the Triebflügel, which was an extraordinary fighter that stood on its tail, and it had 3 wings around the center, and these were driven by rockets on the wingtips. The wings actually spun round and round like a helicopter rotor, lifting the fighter off the ground. It would climb vertically and then gradually push over into level flight.
With the defeat of Nazi Germany, these advanced VTOL designs never make it off the drawing board. But they're not forgotten. Within a few years, their designers are back in business.
Around 1950, the Luftwaffe had been reborn in Germany, and the Germans had a lot of designers with experience of all sorts of clever things like vertical takeoff, jet propulsion. They were eager to flex their muscles and say, look, we've lost none of our expertise.
When the German aircraft designers got back into business after World War II, they were 10 years behind the Americans, the British, the Russians. They decided rather than try and catch up, they'd leapfrog over the technology, which is why they went for vertical takeoff.
As early as 1954, the British Rolls-Royce company unveils a weird machine called the Flying Bedstead. The plane is powered by 2 jet engines with tailpipes bent at 90-degree angles to provide downward thrust.
The British Flying Bedstead proved that jet-powered vertical takeoff would work, but it also revealed a problem. The lift engines are useless in forward flight, so they're a dead weight, and that reduces the aircraft's combat performance. And it also appeared that the jet engines required huge amounts of fuel to get the aircraft off the ground.
In the late 50s and early 60s, work goes on in America and Europe to build miniature, lightweight lifting jets to solve the problem of vertical takeoff. The British Rolls-Royce company leads the way.
You have to remember that the German Air Force felt it had been defeated in World War II because of the superiority of the British Merlin engine. Now, many of these German fighter pilots were in charge of the post-war, the Cold War Luftwaffe. So they said to themselves, well, a British Rolls-Royce engine and vertical technology, that's the way to go.
The primary threat to Germany in the 1950s and 60s was a mass attack by Soviet tanks. To counter this threat, the new Luftwaffe turns to the legendary Nazi aircraft engineer Kurt Tank. The Luftwaffe wants a VTOL tank buster.
Kurt Tank was a remarkable man. He not only was top designer of the great Focke-Wulf company, but he also was their chief test pilot. He produced brilliant aeroplanes like the Focke-Wulf 190 fighter.
The Focke-Wulf 190 was one of the most durable and versatile fighter aircraft in the Luftwaffe, doubling as a bomber and ground attack plane. As well as the FW-190, Tank designed the Triebflügel, the world's first proposal for a vertical takeoff fighter.
Kurt Tank was famous for producing tough, reliable, battle-hardened aircraft that could survive a lot of damage. He took that design philosophy into the post-war era in building the VAC 191. In effect, the 191 is a modern VTOL version of his old World War II Focke-Wulf 190.
For vertical takeoff, the VAC 191 uses a pair of Rolls-Royce lift engines, one mounted directly behind the cockpit and one aft of the wing. There is a separate, bigger jet engine for forward flight.
There was a great deal of interest in this aircraft as a potential strike machine operating in the high transonic region.
In the post-war years, there were lots of wacky VTOL projects, but Kurt Tank's VAC 191 is a beautiful little airplane. It really worked.
What the new Luftwaffe now needs is a fast VTOL interceptor fighter to fly top cover for its VAC 191 attack planes. They turn to another legendary aircraft engineer of the Nazi era, Willy Messerschmitt, designer of the Me-262, the first operational jet fighter. But Messerschmitt is not happy with the approach to VTOL being taken by his old rival, Kurt Tank. He doesn't think the Rolls-Royce lift engines are the answer.
Willy Messerschmitt was a fighter pro. He knew that burdening a fighter with useless lift engines would be a complete waste of time. But Messerschmitt was good at thinking out the box. He had a solution.
Messerschmitt's solution is simple. Why rely on lifting jets? Why not use the same jet engines for forward and vertical flight? If the jet engines are mounted on the wingtips, they can revolve through 90 degrees to do both jobs. For vertical takeoff, they point downwards, then swivel to point forward for ordinary flight. This configuration eliminates the weight of the lift engines altogether. Messerschmitt starts working on a new VTOL fighter design incorporating the swivel jet idea. It is called the VJ-101, with the V standing for VTOL and the J for Jagdflieger, the German word for fighter. It is the successor to Messerschmitt's World War II Me-109 and Me-262 fighters. This new Messerschmitt also has an American pedigree.
To speed up the development process, Messerschmitt used the fuselage of the American F-104 starfighter that he was already building for the Luftwaffe. In effect, his VTOL VJ-101 is actually a vertical takeoff starfighter.
The first VJ-101 flies on April the 10th, 1963.
The VJ-101C X1 had two jet engines in the fuselage and a jet engine pod on each wingtip. And these were swiveling. They could blow downwards for lift or blow to the rear for propulsion.
The VJ-101 will break the sound barrier in July 1964, the first VTOL aircraft to hit that milestone. It sparks the interest of the US military.
The Fairchild Company in the United States was affiliated with this project as well, and this was seen as possibly a potential high supersonic aircraft in the vicinity of Mach 1.6, Mach 2 region. It flew and demonstrated reasonably good performance.
By the mid-1960s, the German engineering geniuses of World War II had conquered the new technology of vertical takeoff. With Messerschmitt's supersonic VJ-101s now flying top cover to destroy MiG fighters of the Red Air Force, the little Focke-Wulf VAC-191s would take out advancing Soviet tanks. In the battlefields of Vietnam, the German VTOL planes might have added to the mobility of the US Army and Marines. But they would never go into service there.
The problem was, in the end, politics, not the technology of VTOL, which worked for the Germans. Germany couldn't build VTOL aircraft by itself. It needed other countries to buy the aircraft, and the other countries didn't want to buy German aircraft. They wanted to build their own.
The West German government gives in to political and economic pressure and abandons its amazing VTOL jets. The last designs of Willy Messerschmitt and Kurt Tank now reside in museums, forgotten by the world.
The downside of this decision was that NATO was left using long concrete runways. It's just as well we never had to test those in a real shooting war with the Soviets.
On the other side of the Atlantic, America is also working on vertical takeoff. On July the 30th, 1957, the world's first ever VTOL jet prepares to land outside the Pentagon. Its mission is to prove to the US Joint Chiefs of Staff that VTOL technology can be made to work. But it is a mission that will end in disaster. While European VTOL engineering is in full flow after World War II, US interest in vertical takeoff concentrates on helicopters. But the helicopter proves to have a major drawback.
The problem with helicopters is that they have a built-in speed limitation. They can't go faster than about 130 miles an hour. The reason is a phenomenon called retreating blade stall.
As a helicopter flies through the air, the spinning rotor blades meet the oncoming air at different speeds. One blade is moving away from the advancing air, while another is moving towards it. If a helicopter flies too fast, the onrushing air can overtake the retreating blade. This causes the blade to lose lift, and the helicopter stalls in the air. The 3 US military services begin to design the impossible: to find a way to combine VTOL with a fast combat performance.
One attempt that the United States made in the field of vertical takeoff and landing was driven really by the Navy's desire to try to spread the base of air supports so that ships, even ships that were not considered aircraft carriers, would have the ability to protect themselves with interceptors of one sort or another.
This need would lead to the development of a groundbreaking aircraft, simply called the Pogo.
The Pogo concept is very similar to the early Nazi designs for vertical takeoff. The aircraft sits on its tail, has a big propeller at the front. The propeller lifts it off, then once it's in the air, it flips onto its belly and flies away like a conventional plane.
I was involved with the Convair Pogo from the time it started, even before it was built. And the pilot of the Pogo was J.F. Skeets Coleman. Skeets Coleman was a pilot. He was a very good ex-Marine pilot. But he was hired because there was no flying job at the moment, and so he was hired as a flight test engineer. But when Sam Shannon, who was the head of flight research, said, "I'm not going to fly the Pogo. Who wants to fly it?" and Skeets Coleman raised his hand and said, "I'd like to fly it."
In 1954, Skeets Coleman became the first pilot in history to take off and land successfully in a VTOL plane other than a helicopter. But the Pogo concept is far from perfect.
In a helicopter, you have a stick, and if you want to go right or left or forward or 45 degrees, you just move the stick in the direction you want to go. You couldn't do that with the Pogo.
The pilot of the Pogo couldn't see the ground as he's coming down to land because it's behind him. Now, you might be able to do that under test conditions, but it'd be dangerous in combat.
Skeets Coleman is one of the few individuals around who is able to pilot the Pogo successfully.
We had concerns about visibility even before the airplane ever flew. But Skeets Coleman, had about 50 hours of training in hover, at the Moffett Field Tunnel at NASA Ames, and it was because of that training that he was able to fly that airplane and hover.
When one looked at the practicalities of actually doing this in the real world, on a pitching, heaving deck on a dark and stormy night, or during even routine operations during the day, it was quite clear that this was completely impractical.
If they'd built 500 of them, they probably would have lost 250 of them in crashes.
But the Pogo suffered from an even more insidious defect, one that would condemn a generation of aircraft to the scrap heap.
Well, the Pogo, of course, was a propeller-driven airplane. And, you know, that was about the time when you started talking propellers to the naval fighters. They said, what are you talking about? I mean, we got jets. You know, we don't want any propeller-driven airplane. Nobody wanted propeller airplanes anymore. They wanted jets.
So they decide to try again with the Pogo tail-sitting idea, but this time they replace the prop at the front of the plane with a jet engine at the back.
The new plane is the world's first ever vertical takeoff jet, the weird Ryan X-13 Vertijet.
Tail-sitting VTOLs were tried elsewhere. We tried in the Air Force to do the same thing with a project called the X-13 Vertijet. But once again, we were dealing here with an aircraft that was really strictly a technology demonstrator. It was not itself intended to lead to a combat derivative of its design. Rather, it would have led to a technology that might have been exploited by a future combat aircraft.
The Vertijet lands and takes off on its tail and is powered by a single jet engine. In place of landing gear, the X-13 relies on a simple hook mounted under its nose. Instead of a launching pad or runway, it is mated to the flatbed of a truck. The Vertijet has one other revolutionary feature. In order to give the pilot some control while hovering, the aircraft's jet exhaust nozzle features a technological advancement impossible just a few years earlier. It can swivel to point the jet blast in different directions.
It was an airplane that was controllable, and it was a pretty fast airplane level flight, too. It had to land on a vertical platform, you know, and hook onto that platform. And then that was kind of cumbersome. And in other words, you couldn't just go and land it at some field. We had to have this platform with you anytime you wanted to land it. But it was the first all-jet VTOL.
On July the 30th, 1957, the Vertijet prepares to land outside the Pentagon.
This was a big day for the future of American VTOL. The point was to demonstrate in front of all the senior military officers that VTOL would work. If it did, the future of the technology was assured.
Piloting that day is Peter Girard, chief test pilot of the Ryan Aircraft Company. He knows the Vertijet well and intends to land the plane in the Pentagon parking.
There'd never been a demonstration like this in front of the Pentagon. There were over 3,000 officers and journalists waiting to see this aeroplane land.
As Girard is about to land, everything goes haywire. Even in the short flight from Andrews Air Force Base, the X-13 has used up much of its fuel. Girard just manages to land before he runs out of gas.
He came very close to losing the aircraft. He just managed to land before he ran out of fuel. Okay, it was a technical success, but the military knew how close he'd come to disaster, and it put VTOL on the back burner for many years.
It's always been controversial. It was controversial in the 50s, and it's controversial to today because there's big performance trade-offs that you must give up to get this capability. And the main trade-off is payload and range, because you use a lot of space and a lot of weight and a lot of fuel to get this capability, so that you carry far fewer munitions.
VTOL has been a dream of people who want to do fighter aviation from unprepared fields since, certainly since World War II. It's a huge burden in the design of an airplane. As soon as you design an airplane to have a capability to take off vertically, you've basically doomed it forever to be a bad fighter.
The Air Force slashes its financial support for the Vertijet. The X-13 flies for the last time only a few weeks after Girard's landing at the Pentagon.
Curiously, it's the Vertijet's test pilot, Peter Gerard, who becomes really excited by the prospect of VTOL, and he devotes himself to finding a solution to the weight and fuel problem.
Girard comes up with perhaps the strangest idea in VTOL history. The plan is incredibly simple. Rather than build a VTOL jet from scratch, Girard suggests taking an existing high-performance fighter and giving it a VTOL capacity. He chooses the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter, the same plane chosen by Willy Messerschmitt as the basis for his VJ-101 swivel jet.
The F-104A was a very fine airplane. It had a fairly good fuel fraction. The percentage of the total airplane weight, that's fuel, that's energy. It had a pretty good range, and it was one airplane that would guarantee you could always reach Mach 2.2. Looking back on the airplane, it had about twice the supersonic cruise potential that the later airplanes like the F-4 and even particularly the F-15.
But in the 1950s, the US Air Force is run by bomber pilots who want heavy fighter bombers and refuse to order the nimble Starfighter. But Peter Girard has a way of making use of the aircraft.
Gerard's idea was to cross a supersonic fighter with a helicopter, and he hit on a way to do it.
Girard proposes to mount a triangular wing above the fuselage of the F-104. When locked in position, this will act as an ordinary delta wing for forward flight. But this wing hides another use. The three leading edges are shaped to act as wings in their own right, just like the blades of a helicopter. The wing can be spun at high speed, giving the specially equipped F-104 vertical lift.
It was a great idea, but the United States Air Force was simply not interested in the Starfighter, even the vertical takeoff version. They were into bombers.
Girard's VTOL Starfighter never moves off the drawing board. But the idea of crossing a helicopter with a jet fighter excites the US Army.
The US Army was banned by Congress from having its own jet planes. That was the responsibility of the Air Force. But the Army thought of a way around this. If they built a VTOL jet fighter and called it a helicopter, it could get around the rules.
The resulting project is the Sikorsky S-57, which the Army develops in partnership with the US Navy. This is a sleek delta-wing jet plane. The secret of the S-57 is a helicopter-like rotor blade that allows the aircraft to take off vertically. Once aloft, the blade folds away into the fuselage of the S-57. Power for forward flight is provided by a normal jet engine.
Once again, it was the US Air Force that intervened and blocked the development of the Army's VTOL combat aircraft. It was disputes like that in the United States that threw technological leadership to the Europeans.
Only one country manages to develop a genuine VTOL combat plane and get it into service: Great Britain. The British Harrier has been a workhorse of the US Marine Corps for a generation. But the Brits had a series of even more advanced VTOL projects that have remained hidden from view for 40 years. During the Battle of Britain in World War II, the Hawker Hurricane was the workhorse of the RAF, shooting down more enemy planes than the more famous Spitfire. But a decade and a half after that conflict, the Hurricane's designer, Sir Sidney Cam, is a frustrated man. The RAF still relies on his fighters, which are now jet-powered, like the Hunter.
By the 1950s, Sidney Cam is a worried man. England is a poor country. He has to find a new aircraft technology that's so exciting the government will buy it. And he finds that solution in vertical takeoff.
The story begins in Paris in 1956.
In 1956, a famous French designer, Michel Vibo, suddenly said, why don't we design a fighter that can take off vertically? And he hit on a complicated idea where a big jet engine drove a lot of big compressors which blew air in all directions, lifting the aircraft off the ground and then pushing it forward.
Vibo tries to promote his idea with the French Air Force, but gets nowhere. Vibo then turns to NATO for help in turning his idea into reality.
He gave it to NATO, and NATO said, let's pass it to the engine designers at Bristol in England. They had a look at it and said, brilliant idea, but you can do it far more easily. We could do it with a single engine.
A simplified plumbing system is the secret of VTOL flight. It will be known as vectored thrust. All the new engine needs is a plane to hold it.
So Sir Sidney Cam of Hawkers designed the P1127 to take this extraordinary engine.
The first hover flight is on October the 21st, 1960, with Hawker Chief Test Pilot Bill Bedford.
It hovered off the ground at Dunsfold in Surrey, and for the first time ever you had an aeroplane looking like a jet fighter that could hover just off the ground, and it actually did what it was supposed to do.
At last, the technological breakthrough had been made in VTOL. You had an aircraft that could take off vertically and still carry a good combat payload. But you can always trust the politicians to make it more complicated.
NATO decides to launch an international competition for an advanced Mach 2 VTOL fighter to equip every NATO member air force in Europe. It is the biggest international aircraft design competition in aviation history. Sir Sidney Cam begins design work on his entry in early 1961, aiming to develop a supersonic version of the P1127. With its vectored thrust technologically so far ahead of anything else, Cam believes he can win the competition. The new plane is the Hawker P1154.
The P1154 was basically a scaled-up version of the P1127, but it had a bigger, more powerful engine that could go supersonic. In fact, at that point, it had potentially the biggest and most powerful engine in the world.
For strike missions, the P1154 will carry rockets, cluster bombs, and napalm tanks. In the air-to-air configuration, 4 red-top missiles will be carried on the wing pylons. Maximum speed at altitude will be Mach 1.7. But other NATO nations are equally determined to win the NATO competition.
The French produced the Mirage 3V. They already had an excellent fighter, the Mirage 3. The trouble was it needed a very long runway. It took off and landed at 200 miles an hour. So if you're going to take off vertically, you have to stretch the fuselage to take 8 lift jets, which the Dassault company did with the Mirage 3V.
In May 1962, the results of the NATO competition for a supersonic VTOL fighter are announced.
The upshot of the NBMR3 competition was a win for the British, who had the only single-engine aeroplane. It was the only simple one, a Mach 2 fighter, really an impressive aeroplane which didn't need an airfield.
The supersonic P1154 moves into production. Over 5,000 engineers are at work on the project. By April 1964, Hawker has begun to manufacture the prototype aircraft, but it never flies.
Just as they were testing the jet engine for the P1154, a new government was elected in Britain, which decided to make budget cuts. The first thing they axed was the P1154. But that meant that a long, proud, independent tradition of British aircraft manufacturing was ended with a stroke of a pen.
There is one last surprise in the British VTOL story.
When the P1154 was cancelled in 1964, the government said, well, as a special concession, we're prepared to fund a simple version of the P1154 with the Pegasus engine, a lower-powered engine, a much smaller aeroplane, justify little tactical strike and reconnaissance missions. And the result was the Harrier.
Of all these aircraft systems that were derived, the one that really had the most lasting significance, and the only one that really did turn out to be a practicable machine in any way, was the British Harrier.
Ultimately, the success of an aircraft is measured by external customers who will buy the plane. For the Harrier, outside events intervene. In 1967, the 6-day war between Israel and the Arab nations erupts.
In the early hours of the war, the Israeli Air Force makes a devastating preemptive attack on the Arab airfields, wiping out all the opposition. The case for VTOL, as opposed to long runways, is finally being made, and that argument is heard loud and clear in Europe and America.
In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, the US Marine Corps decides to buy the British Harrier.
What really saved the Harrier was it was adopted by the US Marine Corps. They're used to operating without 10,000-foot runways, and they experimented with the Harrier and found it could do all sorts of brilliant missions. And it was developed further into new versions, which are still in use and will be in use for quite a long time to come, with both the UK and the Marine Corps.
In the wars at the end of the 20th century, the Harrier proves invaluable. It protects the British fleet during the Falklands War of 1982. It provides tactical support in Operation Desert Storm in 1991. It is active in the Iraq War of 2003. The brilliance of the vectored thrust idea is proven beyond a doubt. But the Harrier is only one of two VTOL fighters to see action during the years of the Cold War. The other is flying for the enemy. In 1975, the end of the Vietnam War sees America in global retreat. Spying an opportunity, the Soviets expand their influence overseas, moving into former US bases in Vietnam. For the first time in Russia's history, a full blue water navy flies the Soviet flag, complete with aircraft carriers.
A new generation of carriers obviously needed a new generation of carrier aircraft. But the Russians had never built carrier aircraft before. So it was a simple step to say, well, let's jump straight into VTOL.
The Soviets believed, and quite correctly, that this type of technology would allow them to have a way to project air power at sea without building the heavy carriers that were so characteristic of the American Navy. It was a cheaper route.
The Soviets were long troubled by Western advances in aviation and rockets, including vertical takeoff. As a result, the Soviets used their communist East German allies to infiltrate the West German government and its Luftwaffe to find out everything about NATO, VTOL, and jet projects. Relying on its German sources, Soviet aircraft designers were kept abreast of the work being done in the West to perfect jet lift technology for vertical flight, especially the Luftwaffe's plans for the VAC-191 fighter bomber. The Moscow Air Show, 1967. Western observers are caught off guard when a MiG-23 fighter appears with VTOL capability. It is equipped with separate jet lift engines as well as ordinary engines for forward flight.
When the MiG appeared, it was so much more advanced than anything flying in Europe or America. This plane seemed combat ready, and that caused a panic.
Once again, the Soviet masters of deception are at work. The big air-to-air missiles fitted to the MiG are only dummies.
Soviet vertical lift engines were very unreliable and used far too much fuel. By the time the vertical takeoff MiG-23 appeared in public, the Soviets had already decided to abandon that line of development.
But the Soviets do not give up on VTOL. Abandoning separate lifting jets, they turn to the British idea of vectored thrust, as used on the Harrier jump jet.
The result was the Yak-36, which is my candidate for the ugliest aircraft ever to fly.
In 1963, there was a test flight of the Yak-36, and this signaled, in an operational sense, the entrance of the Soviet Union into this technology.
The Yak-36 is only a test bed. A dedicated combat plane, the Yak-38, follows, engineered to operate from the Soviet Navy's new fleet of carriers as a fighter bomber. The Yak-38, NATO codename Forger, bears an uncanny resemblance to Kurt Tank's VAC 191, leading some to think this was another classic Russian copy.
The Yak was an engineering nightmare. It had a British-style vector thrust engine, but that wasn't very good, so it also had lift engines, which added to the weight.
The first hover test flight of a single-seat Yak-38 prototype is on September the 22nd, 1970. But the first landing on a naval vessel, the helicopter cruiser Moskva, is not until November 1972.
The Yak-38 proved a dog. It had an operational radius of only 60 miles. It had huge fuel consumption. It could barely stay in the air for 15 minutes.
In December 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. For the next decade, the Soviets will use Afghanistan to test their latest weapons, including the Yak-38.
This was a war meant to test VTOL. Here you were fighting a guerrilla war in the mountains, far from concrete runways. It was designed to test the proposition you could bring in your VTOL jets close to the action, close to the battlefield.
But deployment of the Yak-38 in Afghanistan will prove a disaster.
Because the jet engine has such a high velocity exhaust, when you point it at the ground, you raise all kinds of stones and sticks and corruption if the ground isn't paved and clean. And that stuff recirculates. It flies up in the air, and then your intakes grab it in because you're sitting right above it. All this tremendous storm of debris that you're kicking up with air flowing at 400 or 500 miles an hour, of course, is coming back. It's just sitting there and circulating back into your inlets. And, one takeoff and your engine's wiped out.
As a result, the Soviets abandoned using the Yak-38 in Afghanistan. Instead, they turned to their new generation of helicopter gunships, the Hind. This decision is fatal, for the Hind is slow and vulnerable to America's new shoulder-mounted ground-to-air missile, the Stinger. The CIA will supply hundreds of Stingers to the Afghan insurgents. By 1990, the Soviets will be out of Afghanistan.
Soviet pilots actually despised the Yak-38 because it was so dangerous. They would try and transfer to other duties. They would go sick. It even reached the stage where a group of officers wrote a letter of complaint about the aircraft to the Soviet Central Committee. But in classical fashion, they were disciplined for stepping out of channels.
In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. In that same year, the Yak-38 is finally withdrawn from service after several more fatal crashes. But the era of the vertical takeoff plane is far from over. Up next, we'll take a look at the latest cutting-edge developments in VTOL. The terrorist attack on the Twin Towers on September the 11th, 2001, changed the United States forever and had a direct impact on aircraft technology around the world. US and Allied forces invade Afghanistan. And once again, VTOL is front and center of cutting-edge design in aviation development.
The air war in Afghanistan began in the fall of 2001, and the U.S. Air Force quickly realized it had trouble bringing its fighters close enough to the fight.
U.S. combat planes are forced to fly long hours from carriers or bases thousands of miles away to support ground troops. The challenge leads to a revolution in the thinking of the United States Air Force.
One of the keys behind this came when the Chief of Staff, General John Jumper, visited the air base at Bagram in Afghanistan. Bagram was an old Soviet base with a crumbling concrete runway. It could host A-10s, but had difficulty accommodating many other types of aircraft. Jumper said, "This is an air base that's ready-made for vertical takeoff and landing."
The U.S. Air Force was opposed to VTOL since the failure of the Ryan X-13 Vertijet back in the 1950s.
The Air Force toyed with the idea of buying vertical takeoff aircraft in the 1950s and 1960s. But ultimately, at that point in time, they just didn't have the combat capability that the Air Force needed.
The U.S. Air Force even rejected the British Harrier.
Everyone knows the Harrier is a bit difficult to fly. It turned out to be vulnerable in the Gulf War, and 5 Harriers were lost, mostly due to enemy ground fire, usually anti-aircraft fire.
But Afghanistan changed the rules. America realized in the war against terror that you could end up fighting in places far from prepared runways and major bases. She required the flexibility that VTOL gives you.
The Air Force now expects to use vertical takeoff and landing aircraft in its expeditionary operations in the future. So for the first time, the Air Force is considering buying a vertical takeoff and landing fighter to use in expeditionary operations in the future.
That aircraft is the most advanced combat VTOL jet ever built. The Lockheed Martin F-35 Joint Strike Fighter.
A tremendous breakthrough in vertical technology came with the development of the X-35, the version of the Joint Strike Fighter that will incorporate vertical takeoff technology. For the first time, the Lockheed Martin JSF conquers most of the problems of vertical takeoff and landing. It has enough power and enough of a safety margin and several other top advances that make it a really front-line vertical takeoff fighter in a way that the Harrier never really was.
The secret of the F-35 lies in its revolutionary engine, a development of the Harrier's vectored thrust power plant.
The Harrier used by the United States Marine Corps is not stealthy. The nature of the vector thrust engine with the hot gases expelled underneath are not stealth friendly. But the United States Air Force wants a stealth aircraft in the F-35, so it needs a different kind of engine.
There are 2 parts to the lifting system in the F-35. The first is the lift fan. About half of the thrust needed to hover and land is created by forcing air downward through a pair of doors that open directly behind the cockpit. Power comes by linking the lift fan to the F-35's ordinary jet engine via a drive shaft. The second part is thrust created by blasting hot gases from the engine downward through a nozzle, a modern adaptation of the idea originally pioneered in the Ryan X-13 Vertijet of 1957. The vertical thrust from the front lift fan and the aft jet nozzle provides twice the power of the current Harrier's vectored thrust jet engine.
It's taken us 40 years to get back to the kind of aircraft proposed in the original British P-1154 with its large engine and supersonic capability. If you like, today's F-35 is just a modern version of the P-1154.
Not everyone agrees the VTOL F-35 will work. Pierre Sprey helped design the F-15 and F-16 fighters.
And I predict that before the airplane is deployed, the major variants of it will not have VTOL, if it's deployed at all. If people by that time are so uninterested in war that they don't care what the airplane carries or how well it maneuvers, then maybe they'll buy it as is and just have another hopeless airplane like the Harrier, but maybe a little supersonic. If people have any insistence at all that it shows some ability to carry bombs some distance or some ability to actually maneuver with some ancient jet fighter, then that variant will almost certainly drop the VTOL.
The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have raised other questions regarding VTOL combat.
It's easy to bring a vertical takeoff and landing fighter into a base, but the question is how can you rearm it and refuel it once it's there? That makes the supply and maintenance of fighters a key limiting factor in the ability to use vertical takeoff and landing craft at expeditionary bases. You need to have an airstrip that will accommodate at the very least C-130s and better yet C-17s in order to really supply a VTOL fighter base.
Many engineers believe the future of VTOL lies with the F-35. When it enters service in the next decade, it will be the true successor of the Pogo, the Vertijet, and the Harrier.
The fact is that there's nothing right now to touch the F-A-22 and the F-35 for a combination of factors. It's not just the airframe, but it's also the avionics, the radar, the communications, the weapons, and other systems that go on those airframes. So at the moment, if the F-A-22 and the F-35 go into full-rate production, those aircraft will remain the dominant fighters.
Many years ago, the American inventor Thomas Edison remarked, "The airplane won't amount to a damn thing until they get a machine that will act like a hummingbird. Go straight up, go forward, go backward, come straight down, and alight like a hummingbird." With the F-35, Edison's hummingbird is closer to reality.